As a pilot, he was called Tex, a reference to his home state. He joined the Air Force ROTC in college, but never flew until he got into flight school years later. He flew 62 combat missions in Korea and served alongside the likes of Buzz Aldrin and John Glenn. He was lead solo pilot in the Air Force Thunderbirds flight demonstration team, co-wrote the first tactical manual for fighter pilots, and was director of the Fighter Weapons School, the Air Force's Top Gun Academy. He flew 25 missions in Vietnam before being shot down on a strafing run. He was imprisoned by the North Vietnamese for the next 7 years. When he returned home, he asked only for a banana split and his next assignment. He is Sam Johnson, and he is a legend of Airpower. Sam Johnson was born in San Antonio, Texas on October 11, 1930. He went to high school in Dallas and studied business administration at Southern Methodist University. He signed up for Air Force ROTC, the only ROTC training SMU offered, but he had little interest in aviation.
This was a man who had really absolutely nothing to do with aviation before he joined the military and signed up to fly. He was, on track to be a businessman, to live his life in Texas, not serving in the military. When Korea happened and when he volunteered and then volunteered to fly, he knew that that was what he wanted to do with his life.
I was in the first class, and they called the whole class up for after graduation for the Korean War. And I said, if I'm going to be in the Air Force, I want to fly airplanes, and I applied for flying school and got it. So we graduated on May the 30th, I believe, and in July the 8th or 9th, somewhere in there, I was in flying school down in Bartow, Florida, flying T-6s. Never been in an airplane in my life, so that was the first airplane I was in. I loved it.
Johnson was an outstanding pilot. He rose to the top of his class and became friends with another hot stick, Buzz Aldrin.
Sometimes they let two students go together, believe it or not. Kind of dangerous, but I was in the front seat. Buzz and I checked the airplane. He checked one side, I checked the other. We got in, pushed the button to start the engine. It wouldn't start. Nothing happened. Tried again. I said, Buzz, this thing won't start. Crew chiefs are down there laughing their skin off because there wasn't any prop on the airplane.
Nonetheless, Johnson and Aldrin emerged as the top pilots in their class. As a reward, Johnson got the chance to fly a World War II vintage P-51. It was far and away the fastest, most maneuverable plane he'd ever flown. And Johnson decided before he reached the ground that he would ask for assignment to a P-51 squadron. The P-51 was, however, a plane at the end of its useful life. The Air Force assigned Johnson instead to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada to learn how to fly the new F-86. As soon as he was combat ready, the Air Force shipped him to Korea. The early days of the Korean War had been fought largely by World War II veterans who had learned combat tactics the hard way in battles over Germany and Japan. They knew that no matter what the Air Force said, the newly minted pilots arriving from the States were far from ready for combat. When Johnson arrived, he was, like just about every other fighter pilot, confident, bordering on arrogant, wanting nothing more than to get into combat and record a few kills. but their commanders held the young flyers back. Hotshots at flight school or not, the vets knew the young officers were not ready for combat. They eased Johnson and the rest into combat, taking them out on gold brick runs to the edge of battle.
He said he flew with the best of the bunch, and it really honed his skills while he was there, and it helped him grow up in a lot of ways.
Johnson and his friends, particularly Aldrin, who had a talent for engineering, modified their aircraft on the ground to get as much performance out of them as they could. They went as far, in fact, as putting car wax on the front edges of the jet's wings, which decreased drag and squeezed a few extra knots out of the planes in battle. For all of that, what Johnson learned most was that the key to survival in combat was discipline. There was simply not time for debate and discussion of what came next.
I'll never forget, we were up one day, and when your leader tells you to brake, boy, you do. And he said, brake left. I broke left and looked back, and the MiG was, you could see the tracers, all their rounds are tracers coming at you with their 20 millimeter and 37 millimeter cannon.
Johnson flew 62 combat missions in Korea and got one confirmed kill. He chased a MiG down low into a North Korean river valley. Using the superior speed of the F-86, Johnson followed it lower and lower, down to within 1,000 feet of the ground. He swung in behind the MiG and fired. The MiG burst into flames, and the enemy pilot ejected. Johnson jerked his craft away and flew right into a field of heavy flak.
I mean, there was anti-aircraft all around, and so it was like this, trying to get out of that, and finally got out of it, and I was down on fuel, so way below bingo, so I climbed up to about 40,000 feet and shut it down at 50 pounds of fuel remaining, which is nothing. And I thought, well, I'll glide back and start it up so I can land.
He coasted 100 miles back to Seoul, trading altitude for distance, as if skiing down a long, gentle slope. When he spotted the airbase, he started the engine, pitched up, and landed. The engine flamed out on the runway. Not a drop of fuel remaining. His commanding officer chewed him out for getting so preoccupied with fighting that he forgot something as basic as fuel. Johnson didn't care. He had shot down a MiG. That's why he had come to Korea in the first place. Sam Johnson returned from Korea with one kill, one probable kill, and a damaged MiG on his record. A flight leader, the Air Force assigned him to Nellis Air Force Base as a gunnery instructor, where his job would be to pass on the lessons he had learned in combat. Married with children on the way, he settled into Nellis and enjoyed both the flying and the teaching. He teamed up with another pilot to write the first tactical manual for American fighter pilots. The two spent their days in mock battle over the desert, testing tactics. They enlisted the help of other pilots, many of them combat veterans, to put into writing the lessons they'd learned over Korea.
The way they evaluated you, the way Blessé evaluated you, is you go fly with him, take off, and as soon as you clear the field boundary, start hassling. So you learn to fly and fight real quick in the 96 Squadron at Nellis, and it was great flying.
In 1957, the Air Force made Johnson a member of the Thunderbirds flight demonstration team.
We were the first F-100 team, supersonic Thunderbirds they called us, and we opened the show with a sonic boom when I was flying solo, and they obviously don't do that anymore. And we had no FAA restrictions like they have today, so I'd come by supersonic, they can't hear you, and they'd see you go by, and then kaboom.
After 2 years with the Thunderbirds, he began what was, for Air Force officers, the nearly obligatory tour of Europe. He served in France and England, preparing to defend against the Russians if they poured into Germany. He returned to Nellis in 1961 and became director of the Fighter Weapons School, the Air Force's Top Gun program. There, he flew F-100s and the Air Force's newest fighter, the F-4.
That was part of McNamara's folly of trying to build an airplane, an all-purpose airplane that would work for all services. And the F-4 was a Navy airplane, it wasn't an Air Force airplane, and we adapted it.
The first F-4s were not impressive. Though they were fast, maneuverable, and showed signs of toughness, the combat veterans at Nellis wondered how the plane would perform in battle. Designed for use with air-to-air missiles, the plane originally had no machine gun for close-in work. A gun pod had been added almost as an afterthought, and the mechanism for sighting seemed a little more precise than sticking chewing gum on the windshield. In the fall of 1962, as his tenure at Nellis was coming to an end, Johnson got orders to start moving aircraft to Florida as quickly and as quietly as possible. Secret spy plane photography had confirmed that the Russians were moving nuclear missiles into Cuba, and it seemed as if an invasion would be necessary. Johnson's Nellis pilots started moving aircraft around in ways they believed would confuse Cuban radar and any Soviet spies working near Florida air bases. They'd fly in a big group of planes, refuel, and then fly out another, slightly smaller group.
We ended up putting, I can't remember, I think it was 198 airplanes on the ground down there, fully loaded, ready to go at a moment's notice. And when I got back after the last trip down, escorting airplanes down there, they called me one night at midnight and said, "You're going down there as the Air Division plans officer."
Down there was, of course, Cuba. Johnson was one of several officers designated to serve as forward air controllers, a liaison between the troops on the ground who needed air cover and the Air Force, which meant that when the United States invaded Cuba, he was going in with the ground troops. Johnson reported to parachute school at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. As it turned out, President Kennedy defused the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Cold War stayed cold. The invasion Johnson trained for didn't happen, but he was asked to stay on to write the first direct air support manual for the Air Force. To this day, when pilots and forward air controllers learn how to support ground troops, they do it according to a book Johnson helped write. Though the conflict between communism and the West had not broken out into war over Cuba, on the other side of the globe, a long simmering civil war was about to become a face-off between superpowers. Because of his expertise in setting up the Direct Air Support Center, in 1965, the Air Force assigned Sam Johnson to MAC-V, the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. His job was to help set up and coordinate the first B-52 strikes against communist North Vietnam. When he arrived in country, he was struck with how strange the war was compared to his previous combat experience. It struck him particularly one night when he was manning the Emergency Action Center during one of the first pitched ground battles of the war.
All of a sudden, this red phone rang, and I picked it up, and they said, "This is the White House. What's going on over there?" In fact, I think he said, "What the hell's going on over there?"
The White House, it turned out, had been watching reports of the battle on television, and the president and his men didn't like what they were seeing.
They're in hand-to-hand combat and don't have time to talk to us at the moment. And he slammed the phone down. I woke up Westmoreland, and we found out that what had happened is they had committed all their reserves. They were in hand-to-hand combat, and they had encountered a full division of North Vietnamese regular troops. And it was the first firefight like that. You probably read stories about it. But the press was with them. And the press went in with them, and when they saw guys getting killed, they got scared and ran back to the shore and said, "Our guys are getting killed." And, you know, no kidding, it's a war.
Soon after that, Johnson injured his knee and rotated back to the United States for rehab. As a veteran of 2 wars, he could probably have stayed out of combat, but decided, once his knee healed, to put in for a return assignment to Vietnam.
You know, a real fighter pilot doesn't want the easy way out, in my view. And being an ops officer in a situation like that is really a neat deal, because you got a lot of great guys around you and good airplane.
Upon his return to Vietnam, he found the war as weird as it had ever been. Pilots flying over enemy territory faced rules of engagement that made absolutely no sense. They were prohibited, among other things, from doing what pilots had been doing since aircraft first went into battle: attacking targets of opportunity. In every previous war, pilots who had completed their missions were encouraged to expend their leftover ordnance on enemy trains or convoys they came across on the trip home. In Vietnam, however, pilots were ordered to return with leftover ordnance still hanging from their wings.
We got out and on the way back found a bridge and dropped on it and took it out. So we got rid of all our ordnance, but they didn't like that when I got back on the ground. What'd you do that for? Well, they're targets of opportunity, and this is a war, isn't it? And I told them, man, if you don't want me to drop bombs, don't put them on the airplane.
On Johnson's 25th mission, he was running reconnaissance on a highway the North Vietnamese used to move supplies into the south. He spotted barges moving trucks across a river and decided to attack. Coming in low and fast, he felt almost invulnerable.
You felt like, you know, if you make the airplane go 1,000 miles an hour, they can't hit you, that's wrong.
Just as Johnson was about to pickle his bombs, his plane got hit.
So I pulled it up, and as we pulled up, we got hit about 4 more times with bigger stuff. And first time I've ever seen every light in the cockpit come on, every warning light.
Unable to make it home, Johnson and his backseater ejected over enemy territory. They were quickly captured and taken to 2 houses, one for Johnson, one for his co-pilot. Johnson had a broken back, a broken arm, and a dislocated shoulder. The North Vietnamese held them there for nearly 2 weeks.
They would pull you out for interrogation. You never knew how it was going to be, and whether you're going to come back or not. And I remember, you know, at night you hear the jingle of the keys. You say, "Oh God!" That feeling inside you, knowing that is he coming towards my door? And if they got closer, and then you hear the keys in the door lock being turned, and you realize, okay, it's somebody else. In a way, you go, whew.
During that time, they came in one night and blindfolded me and took me out into a room that was set up like a courtroom with a judge and a jury, the whole works. Through an interpreter, I was sitting there tied to a stool. They, through an interpreter, said, "You're guilty and we're going to kill you. You know, you're a war criminal." So they blindfolded me again, took me out in the woods, and when they took the blindfold off, I was standing in front of a slit trench, and there were 5 guys out there with AK-47 rifles, and they took clips out of their belt, jammed them in, charged the rifle, pointed them at me, and I have to tell you, I was praying harder than I ever prayed in my life. And the Lord came through. And when he said fire, those guns went click, 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 click. And I laughed at them. I don't know what made me laugh, but they kicked me in a slit trench and left me there for a while. But I have to tell you, from that moment on, I never had any fear of them. I never feared them again, because I knew the Lord was with me.
A few days later, the North Vietnamese moved Johnson and his co-pilot to Hanoi and put them in a former French stockade that American POWs had christened the Heartbreak Hotel. For the next 2 years, his family back home had no idea whether he was alive or dead. For 2 years after that, they knew he was alive but had no correspondence with him. For almost 7 years, he was the subject of both physical and mental torture. His life was threatened so much, it became commonplace.
I am constantly awed when I've read about Sam Johnson, when I've talked to him on the phone, when I sat next to him at breakfast a few years ago. I had no idea. He's just the nicest man. I knew nothing about his past and what he had been through. And when I understood it, I just admire him a great deal, and his ability to remain so human and so compassionate and so hopeful after going through an ordeal that no human being should ever have to suffer.
If there is a single moment of his captivity when Johnson's character revealed itself, it was upon his release from solitary confinement. After 4 years of communicating only by tapping on a wall, Johnson walked into a cell shared by 2 American officers. He did his best to stand at attention, saluted, and said, "Lieutenant Sam Johnson, reporting for duty, sir."
Well, I learned you can put up with a lot and get by. The body's very resilient. And the mind is, your brain is a computer that's got every thing that you've ever done in your life stored in it. And if people will just use it, it'll work.
Johnson came home with the other POWs in 1973. He reunited with his family, his wife and 3 children, now grown to adulthood, and embarked on a long and painful series of operations to restore him to health. In 1991, his home district in Texas elected him to Congress. Even as a member of Congress, Johnson has continued to fly. He's racked up more than 500 hours in small planes, has flown along the Rio Grande with the Border Patrol, and has piloted both the F-15 and F-16.
I've had a lot of opportunities to fly airplanes that other guys don't get nowadays, and through a significant era of the history of the Air Force. And I just feel fortunate, and I think being a fighter pilot's the greatest thing that ever happened.